Hello! It's 2013 and I am Mr. Miller, and I'm here to read to you the first of several affirmative cases for this year's debate topic concerning Cuba and Venezuela and Mexico. And what I'm going to want you to do is to flow it, okay, as best you can. If you need to hit pause, gonna get your notes down and then hit play again. Every time you hit pause, keep track, have a little tally mark like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So let's say on this first case here you pause 10 times, and maybe on the second case you pause 8 times, and then 7 times, and then 6, and then 5, 5, 3, 2. And hopefully you can get to the point where you don't have to pause at all. For some people you might have to watch it twice, and that's okay too. It doesn't really matter where you start, it's where you end up. It's what direction you're going. Are you improving? Are you trying to improve? Okay. And then what I want you to do is to look at 2 possible attacks. Okay, one is unintended consequences. What could be some possible unintended consequences? See, you can have, here's what we want to have, but then here's some other stuff here that we really haven't thought about. Ooh, if it happens, then you could be in trouble. So, on the negative, I want you to look for unintended consequences. Okay? And these end up turning into DAs, more or less. Okay, so without further ado, here we go. Observation 1, Inherency. The U.S. federal government remains committed to the economic embargo of Cuba. Subpoint A, the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act commits the United States federal government to an economic embargo of Cuba. Brereton, 2012. On March 12, 1996, the United States Congress passed one of the most regressive and draconic foreign policy initiatives in recent memory with the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, also known as the Helms-Burton Act. This legislation was enacted in response to a 1996 incident in which the Cuban Air Force shot down 2 civilian planes belonging to the Miami-based anti-Castro initiative, Brothers to the Rescue. Congress passed the act in an attempt to place a stranglehold on Cuba's economy in order to facilitate its long-term goal of expelling Castro from office. Helms-Burton proved to be a costly policy in both terms of resources it consumed as well as the negative impact it had on Washington's reputation. Subpoint B, the Obama administration remains committed to an economic embargo of Cuba. Linz, 12. There is much evidence that Obama clings to the old logic of his predecessors' policies regarding Cuba. The Obama administration continues to enforce the sanctions program through the collection of fines for violations of the regulations. Licenses are still denied to academics and those holding to further cultural exchange. Some 30 U.S. doctors were prevented from participating in the International Congress on Orthopedics in Havana in September 2009, and in October, the trip by the New York Philharmonic was canceled because the orchestra's sponsors did not get licenses. Visas are denied, including a request from the President of the Cuban National Assembly. Observation 2, Harms. Subpoint A, the embargo fails to promote orderly leadership of Cuba. McGovern, 2012. For more than 5 decades, we have obsessed with getting rid of the Castro brothers. Our government has tried to invade Cuba, assassinate its leader, crush its economy, and support organizations and programs designed to overthrow the regime. We have spent hundreds of millions of dollars to achieve this quest. By any measure, our policies have failed miserably. If anything, our policies have been used as an excuse to justify the failures of the Cuban system and to strengthen Havana hardliners opposed to change. Every time a U.S. lawmaker gets up to rattle the sabers, the Cuban people, including most of the pro-democracy activists, recoil. All the huffing and puffing the U.S. lawmakers engage in may play well at fundraisers in the United States, but they do absolutely nothing to improve the lives of the average Cuban family, let alone help support human rights or freedoms in Cuba. Subpoint B, the embargo fails to promote human rights in Cuba. Huddleston, 2010. Perversely, the policy of seeking to isolate Cuba rather than achieve its objective has contributed to undermining the well-being of the Cuban people and to eroding U.S. influence in Cuba and Latin America. It has reinforced the Cuban government's power over its citizens by increasing their dependence on it for every aspect of the livelihood. By slowing the flow of ideas and information, we have unwittingly helped Cuban state security delay Cuba's political and economic evolution towards a more open and representative government. And by too tightly embracing Cuba's brave dissidents, we have provided the Cuban authorities with an excuse to denounce their legitimate efforts to build a more open society. With this in mind, we offer the following plan. The United States federal government will substantially increase its economic engagement toward Cuba by normalizing economic relations with that country. Specifically, the United States federal government will repeal relevant provisions of the Cuban Assets Control Regulations, the Cuban Democracy Act, and the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, along with the Trading with the Enemy Act, so as to allow the resumption of normal economic relations towards Cuba. In addition, we reserve the right to fiat, to define all terms, and to legislative intent. This plan offers the following advantages. Advantage 1. Normalization of relations with Cuba will best ensure a smooth transition for the leadership in Cuba. Economist, March 24, 2012. The sudden collapse of communism risks civil war, or at least the danger that Cuba's formal security and intelligence agencies will become hired guns at the service of drug trafficking and organized crime. The presence of 1.2 million Cuban Americans in South Florida makes it likely that the United States will get dragged into any conflict. Unfortunately, American policy towards Cuba resembles a 50-year tantrum rather than a coherent plan for encouraging a transition to democracy. Subpoint B, economic engagement offers the best hope for a peaceful leadership transition. Slaughter, 2012. 50 years of embargo have failed to bring about regime change in Cuba. Consider the political shortcomings and checkered history of many of our current trading partners. Trade and broader engagement are demonstrably more effective in promoting democratic change than rigid isolation. Such engagement facilitated the fall of the Soviet Union and is logic behind our normalized relations with Vietnam, where more than 50,000 Americans died. Obsolete and ineffective political shackles should not impede today's economic production and cultural exchanges. Advantage 3. Normalization of relations with Cuba will best promote strategic U.S. interests in Latin America. Oh, that's advantage 2, I'm sorry. Subpoint A, the Latin American region is vital to U.S. interest. Perez, 2010. The Latin American region, however, is absolutely critical to our national interest and security. Over 30% of our oil comes from Latin America, more than the U.S. imports from the Middle East. Additionally, over half of our foreign-born population in the United States is Latin American, meaning that a significant portion of American society is intrinsically tied to the region. These immigrants, as well as their sons and daughters, have already begun to take their place among America's social, cultural, and political elite. Subpoint B, the U.S. embargo of Cuba undermines U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere. Perez, 2010. When analyzing ecosystems, environmental scientists seek out keystone species. These are organisms that, despite their small size, function as linchpins